Laughing, my mother told the sentry at the gate. My daughter, no. She's only the +1, 20 years in the Navy, and merely a paper pusher. The young officer checked my identification card twice, went pale under the floodlights, and grabbed the hotline phone with a shaking hand. "Call the base commander now," he said. "Tell him we have a rear admiral standing at the front gate." The floodlight above the guard shack buzzed with a faint electrical hum I still hear sometimes in my sleep, and the night air smelled like diesel and cut grass, the particular smell of every base I've ever walked onto at dusk. My mother had her hand on my elbow when she said it, the same possessive little grip she'd used since I was a teenager, steering me, correcting me, presenting me. If you have ever been the most powerful person in a room, while everyone around you assumed you were the least, comment below with the city and state you're watching from, because what happened in that courtroom 11 months later is the reason I finally stopped explaining myself to people who never once asked what I actually did for a living. Like this video, before you keep going, and subscribe if you've ever had to sit quietly while someone rewrote your entire life story to make themselves feel bigger. 3 things were already moving before that gate ever closed behind me, and none of them had resolved yet. The first was a courtroom clock ticking toward a hearing that could take my son, my pension, and 20 years of classified service, and reduce all of it to a rounding error in a divorce settlement, because 6 weeks earlier, my husband's attorney had filed a motion built entirely on the idea that I was faking a medical condition to avoid losing custody. The second was a manila folder, sealed with a red classification strip, sitting in the bottom drawer of my home office. A folder I had been ordered not to open for 11 years and had never once been tempted to, until the week my marriage started collapsing, and I needed to remember who I actually was. The third was smaller and quieter than the other 2. A voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, left the same night as the gate incident, 4 seconds long. A man's voice saying only, "Ma'am, we need to talk about Bradley's accounts," and then silence. Nothing but the faint static hiss of an open telephone line, before it cut off entirely. Dead air. I didn't know it yet, but that voicemail would end up mattering more than either of the other 2. My name is Diane Calloway, Rear Admiral, United States Navy, 19 years and 4 months of active service. By the night my mother made her joke at the gate, though by the time anyone in my family understood what that actually meant, I had already been humiliated by all 3 of them enough times that the correction stopped feeling like a victory and started feeling like a formality. I kept my maiden name through the marriage, partly out of habit, partly, I admit now, because some part of me already suspected I would need it back one day. My husband was Bradley Whitfield, 41 years old, a partner at a boutique wealth management firm in Alexandria, Virginia, the kind of man who wore a Patek Philippe to dinner parties and told strangers he managed portfolios for senators, and who, for the better part of our 12-year marriage, described my career to anyone who asked as, "Oh, Diane does logistics, paperwork mostly, nothing exciting." He wasn't lying out of malice in the beginning. He simply never asked, and I never corrected him, because correcting him would have meant explaining things I was not permitted to explain, and Bradley was not a man who tolerated a wife with secrets he couldn't access. My work was naval intelligence, deep inside a compartment most people in the service itself never see, coordinating signals analysis and personnel recovery across 2 theaters I am still not allowed to name in full. I flew into places on manifests that listed me as a logistics coordinator. I sat across from foreign officers who had no idea the woman taking notes outranked half the room. I was present for 11 extractions I can discuss now only in the vaguest terms, and I was the officer of record for one operation, codename Silent Fathom, that I will get to, because it is the reason a courtroom in Fairfax County went dead silent 11 months after that gate. I still remember the particular texture of the flight suits we wore on those missions, stiff at the seams from repeated washing, and the metallic taste that settled in the back of your throat after too many hours breathing recycled cabin air over open water. I remember the sound of a rotor blade changing pitch just before a hot extraction, a sound that lives somewhere in your spine long after the deployment ends, resurfacing at odd moments, a slammed car door, a low-flying commercial jet, a thunderstorm rolling in over the Potomac. My mother, Margaret Calloway, 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher with a lifelong hunger for social standing she never quite achieved, had been making some version of that joke since I was 23. At my commissioning ceremony, she told her book club I'd taken an office job with the government. At my sister's wedding, she introduced me to a table of her friends as, "This is Diane. She does something with computers for the Navy. Very boring. Don't ask her about it or she'll talk your ear off." She said it with a smile every time. The particular smile of a woman who believes belittling her daughter in public is a harmless little joke rather than a decision, repeated for 2 decades, to make herself feel like the more impressive woman in the room. My mother's fixed trait, if you want to call it that, was a bottomless, performative superiority. The conviction that her own modest achievements, a teaching pension and a nice house in a nice subdivision, entitled her to look down on a daughter who had actually bled for the country, simply because my daughter's achievements were invisible to her, and therefore, in her mind, didn't count. Bradley's mother, my mother-in-law Corinne Whitfield, was a different flavor of the same disease. Corinne had old family money that had mostly evaporated by the time it reached Bradley, and she compensated for that loss with a rigid, calculating superiority that treated me as a placeholder wife, tolerable but never quite acceptable, a woman who had married up into a family with a name even though, as she once told me at Thanksgiving with a glass of Sancerre in her hand, "You don't really come from anywhere, do you, dear?" Corinne's fixed trait was calculating prepotency, the assumption that every situation could be managed, minimized, or spun in her family's favor if she simply asserted control over the narrative loudly enough and early enough. And then there was Vanessa Reyes-Cole, 36, a junior partner at Bradley's firm, blonde, sharp, ruthlessly ambitious, who I would later learn had been sleeping with my husband for 2 years and 11 months by the time our marriage formally ended. Vanessa's fixed trait was a kind of performative professional arrogance, the belief that competence in a boardroom translated automatically into moral superiority everywhere else, including, apparently, into the right to a married man's attention. She was fond of a specific phrase, one she used at least twice in front of witnesses, once at a firm holiday party, and once, astonishingly, in a deposition transcript I'd later read line by line. "She's not a real officer, she just pushes papers somewhere. Everyone knows that." I want you to remember that sentence. It comes back later, in a very different mouth, in a very different room. The background to all of this, the way the smaller label became my whole identity inside my own family, took root slowly, the way rust takes root, one small surrender at a time. Bradley and I met at a fundraiser in 2011, when I was 31 and freshly promoted to commander, and he was already the golden boy of his firm, charming, generous with his attention, the kind of man who made you feel like the only person in a crowded room. In the beginning, he asked questions. He wanted to know what I did. I gave him the version I was allowed to give, vague, procedural, and he nodded along, satisfied, and never asked follow-up questions again, not once, for 12 years. I told myself that was respect for operational security. I understand now it was disinterest, dressed up as discretion. Over the years, every time I came home from a deployment I couldn't fully describe, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork, Bradley filled the silence with his own explanation, and the explanation calcified into fact inside our household. Diane's job is administrative. Diane handles logistics. Diane is basically a scheduler with a security clearance. "Isn't that hilarious?" he'd say at dinner parties. And people would laugh, and I would smile the smile I had practiced since childhood, the smile that says nothing and costs everything. Our son Jack was born in 2014, and it was after Jack that the dynamic hardened into something closer to a script. Every parent-teacher conference, Bradley introduced himself first, gave his title, his firm, his accomplishments, and then gestured at me almost as an afterthought. "And this is Jack's mother, she works for the Navy, something with files." There was a specific dinner, Jack's 3rd Christmas, when Bradley's uncle asked me directly what rank I held, and Bradley answered for me before I could open my mouth. "Oh, she's somewhere in the middle, nothing glamorous." And the table moved on to the cranberry sauce within 4 seconds. 4 seconds that I replayed for years afterward, wondering what would have happened if I'd simply said the word commander out loud myself. I began to notice, somewhere around Jack's 4th birthday, that I had stopped correcting anyone. Not my mother, not Corinne, not Bradley, not the parents at school functions. The correction had started to feel exhausting, in a way that silence didn't, and silence, I told myself, was strategic. It kept my work compartmentalized exactly where it needed to be. What I didn't admit to myself, not for years, was that the silence had started to feel like erasure, and erasure, unlike a classified compartment, doesn't stay neatly contained. It bleeds into how you see yourself when no one else is watching. The institutional thread, the one I'm calling Loop A, started on a Tuesday in March, 4 days after a physical collapse I had at a change of command ceremony at Naval Station Norfolk. A collapse that turned out to be a delayed complication from a spinal injury I sustained during an operation in 2016, I still cannot fully discuss. An injury that had been quietly worsening for years, under a mountain of anti-inflammatories and denial. I went down mid-salute in front of 200 sailors and had to be carried out on a stretcher, the white ceiling tiles of the base infirmary sliding past overhead in a blur. The antiseptic smell sharp enough to sting. A young corpsman gripping my hand and telling me, "Ma'am, stay with us, we've got you," in a voice that cracked slightly on the last word. Bradley was not there. Bradley was, as I would later learn from that 4-second voicemail and everything that followed it, in Miami that weekend with Vanessa, at a conference that did not, according to the firm's own records, exist. 4 days after my collapse, while I was still recovering, still on medical leave, his attorney, a man named Todd Pierce, filed an emergency motion in Fairfax County Circuit Court, alleging that I was, and I'm going to use the exact language from the filing, because I've read it more times than I can count, exhibiting a pattern of exaggerated and potentially fabricated medical symptoms, designed to garner sympathy and manipulate custody proceedings in her favor. Todd Pierce's fixed trait, if I'm being generous, was a kind of gleaming, rehearsed professional arrogance. A man who treated every hearing like a stage he'd built specifically to showcase his own eloquence, and who once told opposing counsel, in front of a court reporter, that my medical claims were, and this is the phrase that would return to haunt him, theatrical at best and fraudulent at worst. The pretext for the motion was custody of Jack, then 9 years old, and the practical target was everything else: my military pension, 31 years of accrued benefits by the time I would have hit mandatory retirement eligibility, the survivor benefit plan, and a joint investment account that Bradley's filing claimed was, quote, primarily funded through his professional earnings, and therefore his separate property, a claim that was, I would later discover, almost the exact opposite of the truth. The pretext wasn't the injury itself. It was what the injury represented: an opening, a moment of maximum vulnerability, the exact moment the genre this story lives in has taught me to recognize now, though I did not recognize it in real time, not fully, not until the pieces started arriving on their own. The concrete clue for Loop A arrived that same week, sealed inside a manila envelope with a Department of the Navy return address and a classification cover sheet, forwarded to my home from my former command, with a short handwritten note from my old executive officer, Captain Lisa Nguyen. Diane, this cleared review last month. Thought you should have it before anyone else does. Whatever's happening with Bradley, you might need this more than you think. I set the envelope on my desk unopened for 6 days, the red strip across the seal, and every time I walked past it, I felt something between dread and relief. The specific feeling of holding a door you're not ready to open, but know you eventually will. The personal betrayal thread, Loop B, was seeded earlier and quieter than the legal one, planted in small moments I only recognized in hindsight as a pattern rather than coincidence. A hotel charge on a shared card, I noticed but didn't mention. A new cologne. A late-night text Bradley angled his phone away from at dinner, in a way that felt, even then, deliberately casual, the kind of casual a man practices in a mirror. The concrete clue was the voicemail, 4 seconds. Ma'am, we need to talk about Bradley's accounts, left by a man who would turn out to be a compliance officer at Bradley's own firm. A man risking his job to warn me about something he'd stumbled onto during a routine audit. Something involving a signature on a home equity line of credit that he did not believe I had actually signed. Loop C. The tension of when and how the truth about who I actually was would surface in front of the people who'd spent years diminishing me. Didn't need a single clue. It lived in every room I walked into for the next several months. In every conversation where I bit down on the correction I wanted to make. In the growing gap between the woman my family described at dinner parties and the woman who had once coordinated the extraction of 6 wounded operators under fire in a country I still cannot name out loud. I want you to sit with the double life for a minute, because it's the part people underestimate most. The week after the emergency motion was filed, I attended my son's school play on a Wednesday evening, sat in a folding chair between Corinne, who spent the intermission explaining to another mother that custody battles are so unfortunate when one parent simply isn't equipped for the pressure, and my own mother, who leaned over during the second act to whisper that maybe if I'd taken an easier job all those years ago, none of this would be happening now. I said nothing. 2 days later, I was on a secure call with a JAG officer I'd worked with a decade earlier, discussing exactly how classified my service record could be partially declassified for a civilian custody proceeding without compromising ongoing operations. A conversation my mother would have had no framework to understand, even if she'd been sitting in the room. That was the whole shape of my life that spring. Folding chairs and secure calls, condescension and classification, and the exhausting discipline of letting neither bleed into the other. Corinne's second appearance, the one I still think about, happened at a birthday dinner for Jack, where she pulled me aside near the coat closet and told me, with the specific gentleness people use when they think they're being kind, that Bradley had always been the more stable partner in this marriage, and that perhaps it would be easier for everyone, especially Jack, if I simply agreed to a settlement rather than dragging this out. Easier for everyone happened to mean easier for Bradley, and I understood, watching her manage her face into something like compassion, that she had already decided the outcome and was simply managing the optics of getting there. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn to every family event for a decade, something heavy and floral that clung to the coat closet long after she'd walked away, and she straightened the collar of my blazer with 2 fingers before she left, an unnervingly maternal gesture from a woman who had just tried to talk me out of my own son. My mother's second appearance was smaller and crueler in its own way. A phone call where she told me she'd run into an old friend from the Navy Wives Club who'd mentioned my collapse at Norfolk, and that she'd told the woman, "Don't worry, Diane's always been a bit dramatic. Comes from working behind a desk too long, I imagine." I hung up the phone and sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Vanessa's second appearance was the sharpest, because it was the only one delivered directly to my face. She showed up, uninvited, to a mediation session Bradley's attorney had scheduled, sitting in the hallway outside the conference room, as though her presence there were incidental, and when I passed her on my way out, she said, quietly enough that only I could hear it, "You know he only married you because you seemed impressive on paper, admiral or whatever. It's kind of funny how none of that actually translates to real life, doesn't it?" I didn't answer her. I have spent my career learning that silence, deployed correctly, is a weapon most people mistake for weakness. The intermediate moment, the one I want to mark clearly, came about a third of the way through this whole ordeal, on the night I finally opened the sealed envelope from Captain Wynne. Inside was a declassified after-action summary for Operation Silent Fathom, the 2016 personnel recovery mission that had cost me 2 vertebral fractures and, apparently, earned me a nomination for the Silver Star that had been sitting in a review queue for 8 years, due to the operation's classification level. Reading my own name attached to that citation, alone at my kitchen table at 11 at night while my husband was supposedly at a late meeting, was the first time in years I had let myself feel, fully and without apology, exactly how much I had actually done, and exactly how small the label paperwork really was next to it. If you've ever had a moment like that, a piece of paper that finally says the truth about you out loud, tell me about it in the comments. And if this story is already getting to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because the next part is where it stops being quiet. Loop B closed first, roughly 7 weeks after the emergency motion, in the ugliest way I could have imagined. I came home early from a physical therapy appointment and found Bradley in our bedroom packing a suitcase, not sneaking, not hiding it, packing openly, almost theatrically, as though he'd been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending. He told me, standing by our closet with my grandmother's jewelry box open on the dresser behind him, that he'd already spoken to Vanessa about moving in together once the divorce was finalized, that he'd been unhappy for years, that being married to someone who couldn't even talk about her own job had made him feel like he was married to a locked door, and that frankly, given my recent, quote, health issues, it might be best for Jack if primary custody went to him, since he could, quote, actually be present and reliable, in a way I apparently couldn't anymore. He said this while zipping a suitcase with 3 of my mother's inherited rings, visibly missing from the jewelry box. Rings I would later learn he had already sold to cover a margin call on a personal investment account he'd hidden from me for over a year. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom and watched the man I had built a life with tell me, with a straight face, that my classified spinal injury was a convenient inconvenience to his relationship timeline, and I said only one sentence to him before I turned around and walked out. You have no idea what I've survived, Bradley, and you're about to find out exactly how little that ignorance protects you. Loop A closed 9 days later in a deposition, not the trial itself but the pre-trial testimony that would end up shaping everything after it. Todd Pierce, confident, smiling, asked me directly, for the court reporter, to describe the nature of my Navy employment, expecting, I think, the same vague nothing everyone had accepted for years. Instead, flanked by the JAG officer I'd consulted, Colonel Marcus Reyes, retired, 61 years old, a man who had spent the back half of his career specifically defending service members' benefits in civilian courts, I answered with a redacted, but formally authorized summary, cleared 2 days earlier, through an expedited security review Marcus had pushed through, using channels most civilian attorneys don't know exist. I described in careful, factual, unemotional language 19 years of active naval intelligence service, a leadership role in 6 classified operations, and a pending Silver Star citation for actions during a 2016 personnel recovery operation that resulted in a permanent partial disability rating from the Department of Veterans Affairs, a disability that had nothing to do with fabrication and everything to do with a piece of flying shrapnel 8 years earlier. Todd Pierce's face, according to Marcus, who described it to me afterward with something close to relish, went through 3 distinct stages: confusion, disbelief, and finally the particular pallor of a man realizing his entire legal strategy had been built on a foundation that had just evaporated under him. He tried, weakly, to suggest the record could be fabricated for the proceeding. Marcus produced the original classification review paperwork, dated and signed 6 weeks before the divorce motion was ever filed. Proof the declassification had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with timing that had simply, finally, caught up with the truth. The preparation and escalation before the final hearing consumed the following weeks in a specific kind of quiet dread, the feeling of watching a storm organize itself on the horizon while you finish the small, ordinary tasks of your life, packing Jack's lunch, attending his soccer games, sitting through one more excruciating dinner with Corinne, where she suggested, apparently unaware the deposition had already happened, that perhaps my, quote, government job was being exaggerated for sympathy in the proceedings. I said nothing to correct her. I had learned, by then, that some corrections are better delivered once, in public, in front of everyone who needs to hear them at the same time. Marcus and I spent those weeks preparing something specific for the final hearing, a formal declassified reading of the Silent Fathom after-action report, timed to be introduced not as a defense, but as direct rebuttal to the fabrication claim itself, since the operation's medical annex documented, in exhaustive clinical detail, the exact injury Todd Pierce had spent months calling theatrical. Meanwhile, the compliance officer who'd left that 4-second voicemail, a quiet, nervous man named Andre Faison, agreed, after weeks of my careful, patient outreach, to testify about the forged signature on the home equity line, a signature forensic analysis would later confirm was not mine, applied to secure a $190,000 loan Bradley had used to cover Vanessa's downtown condo, down payment 8 full months before he ever filed for divorce. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the Fairfax County Circuit Court, Judge Patricia Alvarez presiding, a courtroom with more spectators than any custody hearing I'd ever heard of, because Marcus, without asking my permission, had quietly mentioned the case to a handful of veteran advocacy contacts. And word had spread the way it does in that particular community, until the gallery held not just my brother, Jack's godfather, and Captain Lisa Nguyen, but 11 other veterans in various states of dress uniform and civilian clothes, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a Virginia family court gallery like a wall behind me I hadn't known I still had. Todd Pierce opened by reasserting the fabrication claim, elegant, rehearsed, confident, and it was Corinne, sitting beside Bradley, who leaned toward another spectator during a recess and said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear, "She's not a real officer. Everyone at the firm knows she just pushed papers somewhere. Bradley told us years ago." I watched the words land in the gallery and felt, for the first time in this entire ordeal, something close to calm, because I knew exactly what was coming next, and I knew it would answer her. Marcus called Andre face on first, and the forged signature testimony, supported by a forensic document examiner Marcus had retained months earlier, unraveled Todd Pierce's financial narrative in under 20 minutes, exposing not just the forged loan, but a pattern of transfers into an account under Vanessa's name that Bradley's own firm, once notified, was now conducting an internal investigation into. Andre testified in a grey suit that didn't quite fit him, his hands visibly shaking on the witness stand, and when the forensic examiner held up an enlarged printout comparing my genuine signature against the one on the loan documents, side by side under the courtroom projector, you could see, even from the gallery, how the forged version leaned the wrong direction on the capital D, a detail so small and so specific that it felt almost obscene how much damage one crooked pen stroke had caused, and how close it had come to costing me my son entirely. Then Marcus called his final witness, a retired 3-star admiral named Robert Halstead, who had personally overseen the Silent Fathom operation, and who stood, in full dress uniform, in a Fairfax County courtroom and read, into the record, the formal declassified summary of that operation, describing in specific, granular detail how then Commander Diane Calloway had coordinated the extraction of 6 wounded operators under sustained hostile fire, sustaining a spinal fracture in the process that she had continued working through for 11 more years without a single day of the medical leave she was legally entitled to. When Halstead finished reading, he looked directly at Todd Pierce and said, "This woman has never once, in 19 years, faked an injury, a hardship, or a single line on a personnel record, and I would be careful, counselor, about which officers you decide to call theatrical in a court of law." The gallery, veterans and civilians alike, sat in a silence I could feel on the back of my neck, and Judge Alvarez, who had been taking notes without expression for most of the morning, finally looked up and said, for the record, that the court found the fabrication allegation not only unsupported, but, given the evidence just presented, close to sanctionable, and that the financial fraud allegations against the petitioner would be referred separately for criminal review. I watched Bradley's face go the color of wet paper. I watched my mother, 3 rows back, cover her mouth with one hand. I did not cry. I had promised myself years earlier that I would not give any of them the satisfaction of watching me become the emotional spectacle they'd always assumed I secretly was. Judge Alvarez's gavel came down once, a single flat crack of wood against wood that seemed to hang in the air of that room far longer than it should have. And somewhere behind me, I heard one of the veterans in the gallery, a man I didn't even know, exhale a long breath he must have been holding since Halstead started speaking. The overhead fluorescence buzzed the same way that Floodlight had buzzed at the gate 11 months earlier, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that courtrooms and guard shacks smell almost the same, stale coffee and old paper, and something underneath it like nervous sweat. The weeks after the hearing rearranged everyone's life in ways that felt, to me, less like revenge and more like gravity finally asserting itself. Bradley lost his partnership at the firm within a month, once the internal fraud investigation confirmed the forged signature and the diverted funds, and he now works, according to Jack, at a smaller firm, 2 tiers down from where he used to be, living in a rented townhouse he complains about more than he should given the circumstances. Vanessa was let go from the firm entirely, her name attached publicly enough to the fraud investigation that 2 other firms in the same small professional circle quietly declined to interview her afterward, a specific, targeted kind of professional death in a town that small. Todd Pierce received a formal referral to the state bar for the sanctionable conduct Judge Alvarez had flagged, and I understand, from Marcus, that he no longer takes family law cases at all. Corinne, who had spent a decade managing everyone's optics, found that optics don't recover quickly from a courtroom full of decorated veterans watching her son's fraud exposed in real time, and her social calendar, according to Jack, who still sees her occasionally, has never quite returned to what it was. My mother called me 3 weeks after the hearing, and for the first time in my adult life, she didn't lead with a joke. She told me she'd sat in that gallery and genuinely hadn't understood, until Admiral Halstead started speaking, the actual shape of what I had spent 2 decades doing, while she told her book club I filed paperwork. She apologized, not eloquently, not completely, but genuinely, and admitted that some part of her had always found my quiet more convenient than my truth, because my truth would have required her to sit smaller, in rooms she preferred to dominate. I told her I appreciated the apology, and that we had a lot of rebuilding to do. And we do, slowly, in the specific unglamorous way. Real reconciliation actually happens, not all at once, and not without scar tissue. She has started, in the month since, asking me actual questions about the work I can and can't discuss. Small, awkward questions delivered with none of her old polish, and I have started answering some of them, and it is strange and a little bit wonderful to watch a 68-year-old woman learn, this late in both our lives, how to simply sit still and listen instead of narrating over me. I received my formal Silver Star ceremony 4 months after the hearing, in a small auditorium at the Pentagon, the kind of room with hard wooden seats and a faint smell of floor wax. Jack sitting in the front row in a suit he'd picked out himself, a navy blue blazer 2 sizes too big in the shoulders, that he refused to let me alter because, he said, he wanted to grow into it. My mother sat 2 rows back, in a hat I recognized from her church clothes, dabbing at her eyes with a folded tissue in a way that felt, for once, entirely unrehearsed. Captain Wynne stood at the back of the room the whole time, rather than take a seat, arms crossed, the way she used to stand during briefings when she wanted to see the whole room at once. And as Admiral Halstead pinned the medal to my uniform, I found myself thinking not about Bradley, or Vanessa, or Corinne, or even my mother, but about every folding chair I'd sat in over 20 years, while someone described me as basically a scheduler with a security clearance. I think the lesson, if there is one, isn't really about vindication, because vindication is satisfying, but it isn't the point. The point is that most of the people carrying invisible weight in your life will never announce it, will never correct the small joke at the dinner table, will simply keep showing up, exhausted in ways you've decided not to notice, because noticing would require you to see them as bigger than the label you've assigned them, and that's inconvenient. So here's the only question I want to leave you with. Who in your life is quietly carrying something you've never once bothered to ask about? I never got the chance to fully process any of that, because 2 weeks after the ceremony, on a grey Tuesday morning with rain streaking the window beside my usual table, the smell of burnt espresso thick in the air, a woman I hadn't seen in 11 years walked into a coffee shop near my new apartment, sat down across from me without asking, set a thick folder on the table between us, and said, "Admiral Calloway, my name is Captain Sarah Voss, and I think you're the only person alive who can help me prove what actually happened to my husband in 2016. And if you've made it this far, you already know what kind of person doesn't walk away from a request like that. So go ahead and hit subscribe, because that conversation is where the next story starts."